Hey listeners, it's been an absolute joy to bring you diverse voices and fascinating perspectives on the Legally Speaking podcast season 8. From legal experts to innovators, the conversations have been truly engaging and inspiring. The following highlights are from this season's top 8 rated episodes, showcasing the very best of what we've shared with you. But don't go anywhere. Season 9 is about to air, and we've got something extra special coming your way with our brand new miniseries, Legally on the Move, Careers, Tech and Insights from Dubai. Stay tuned for more exciting content heading your way.
The best people to hire are the pragmatists. Really, it's that pragmatism. It sounds so simple, but it's actually very, very difficult to identify. And in the legal world, it's really, really hard because everything's stacked against us. And this exists everywhere. This kind of completely unnecessary busy work and going around in circles on things. One person's common sense isn't another person's common sense. But coaching people and challenging people to simplify how they're communicating, how they're moving from A to B. We all have finite time. We're not charging by the hour in an in-house role. So we just want to make the maximum impact for the business possible.
On today's Legally Speaking podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Sam Ross. Sam is the Chief Legal Officer at Remote, a global HR platform helping companies hire, manage and pay their team whilst competing in a modern global economy. He was previously VP, General Counsel at Remote, and has a wealth of experience of scaling legal teams for various high-profile businesses. Sam is passionate about using legal operations to create slick processes and actionable insights to deliver legal services. So, a very big warm welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Rob. It's amazing to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. And before we dive into your amazing career and what you're getting up to for the legal world, we do have a customary icebreaker question here, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law on the scale of 1 to 10 if you've seen it?
I haven't seen all of it. I've seen some of it. I would give it, in terms of a law firm, probably a 9, because that kind of the way that it kind of portrays the kind of officiousness, if that's a word, of the office life and kind of people posturing and positioning and making themselves look good and trying not to get screwed by other people. Unfortunately, that is kind of the reality in some law firms. I know that other law firms have, really amazing meritocratic cultures, but they're difficult places, right? Because you can really be exposed there. And the more money you earn, sometimes the riskier your job is and all sorts of things like that. So I would say that if I think about Suits, it's about, a large part of it is about kind of who's got the power in any given episode or a given series. And so I think the in context of like the law firm world, yes, it's quite realistic. And then in context of in-house, very different, because in-house is a completely different job. It's a completely different universe.
Yeah, and I think you gave a really good answer. And with that, we'll move swiftly on to talk all about you. So would you mind, Sam, telling our listeners a bit about your background and career journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I studied English at university, mainly because I was kind of good at it. But I may have watched the DVDs in some cases instead of reading the books, which is why I didn't get into Cambridge. So apologies for that to some professors at the University of Birmingham. But I already had one foot in the workplace when I was at university. So I was really interested in getting into law. I wanted to work in tech law or music law because I also did music on the side. And I found a law firm called Olswang, which doesn't exist anymore. Now it's basically a room in another law firm, but it was a very, very well-established, well-regarded media and tech law firm. And I managed to get a training contract with them. I really liked the firm and what they stood for. They were quite entrepreneurial. The exercise that they had you do when you went for interview was about being an entrepreneur, setting up a cheese shop, which I really loved. So I enjoyed that part of it and was lucky enough to get a training contract with Olswang, which I started in 2007. So went through the training contract with them, absolutely loved that experience, was actually just there with some old friends reminiscing around High Holborn in London the other week, looking at the pubs we used to go to and talking about all the all-nighters that we used to pull, working on deals and stuff. And so did that role, qualified into the corporate team and did like mid-size M&A deals. So I learned how to buy a business, learned how to sell a business, learned how to do due diligence. And that gave like a really good grounding in many different areas of law. And I kind of found that I was always more interested in what was going on the fringes of the deal. So I was like, oh, there's an interesting tax point here. There's an interesting employment law point here. I'm going to go literally physically downstairs to those lawyers in that department and ask them, keep badgering them and bugging them until I understood the issue, which was really annoying for them because they couldn't charge it to the clients. But that was kind of what it was like. I was always interested in what was going on around the main deal, which is obviously suited for a corporate lawyer who does need to understand a bit about everything. And then about 2.5 years into that, I wasn't feeling the transactional, like 100% transactional stuff the whole time. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the buzz of like closing a deal, but I was lucky enough to speak to a really, really good legal recruiter whose name is Marcia, and she sold me an opportunity to go and work for Barclays in their technology division. So Barclays in Canary Wharf, 30 floors of corporate mystery going on there, and on one floor, which is level 22, there was this floor of operations and technology people. And what they were trying to do, this is in 2012, they were trying to build like a little tech kind of innovation hub within Barclays. They were trying to engage with the tech community. They set up like accelerator programs. And so there was a table tennis table, which is really important. And you didn't have to wear a suit. And so it was kind of like a innovative hub within Barclays, and I got a job working as a technology and operations lawyer, and I was responsible for managing kind of legal risks around all of Barclays' overseas tech centers, so their call centers, their tech dev centers, and it was like a really good introduction to working in-house, because there was like 1,000 lawyers at Barclays and loads of impressive people to learn from. So it wasn't kind of unstructured, but it was still kind of more commercial and in-house versus a law firm. And I got to learn about international stuff because I was advising on all these overseas issues and international risks, like international data transfers and all that kind of stuff. Getting to work with colleagues from all the different parts of the bank, because I was working in a team called Ops and Tech, which was like a function that serviced all the different parts of the bank, like the investment bank, Barclaycard, retail bank, etc. And it was just a very, very exciting place to be, because there was a lot of money and a lot of interest in trying to understand what was going on in the world of tech. And it was before it was even called fintech, but that's what it was. Was really lucky at Barclays to be able to get a secondment to the design and digital team for 6 months, where I got to do a totally non-legal role for that period, which kind of opened me up to, oh, wow, there's actually a way of earning money and doing a job that doesn't involve doing law. That's interesting. That's what these people do. They do kind of designs and customer experience stuff and user journeys and all that kind of stuff, which I found really, really fascinating. Even though I'm not a very sort of artistic person by background, I'm not very good at visual things. But I was inspired by what I saw and how those people worked and how they brought things to life through visual depictions of what they wanted a customer to be able to do 20 years from now, that kind of stuff. It was really, really inspiring. Then I decided in 2016 that I had kind of had enough of the big corporate world, and I was lucky enough to meet the PR team of a company called World Remit, which is now called Zeps. And that's a company that was venture capital backed, and they help migrants to send money home through digital means. So kind of a competitor to the traditional like Western Union and MoneyGram and those sorts of players. So one of the new kind of digital remittance companies. And I was their first lawyer. So I was hired in 2016 under the CFO. I was sort of trusted to start the legal function from scratch. And I built that team up for like 3.5 years. Then went to another fintech company called Comply Advantage briefly. Then spent about a year doing some outside general counsel work for some early stage VC-backed companies, and then finally have landed in my current role where I've been for just over 3 years at Remote, again, leading the legal team there.
I always say we're in this hyper-connected world now, particularly with the advancing of obviously technology and AI and the internet and all of that good stuff. But with Remote, we're giving that talent pool that global opportunity. And I think it's super exciting where people can get those jobs of their dreams and they don't have to uproot a family. Myself as a father, and the thought of maybe having to do that uprooting and upheaval and missing out on an opportunity, this could potentially is a game changer. And that's why we're super keen to get you on. But let's stick in terms of your legal lane, because, you're the chief legal officer. So, what are some of the day-to-day responsibilities you have? I know you're touching on it there, and, maybe just talk us through a typical day of a CLO.
Yeah, sure. So, again, it sounds a bit cliched, but given managing a relatively large team, I'm now at a point where I'm basically an escalation point for decision making. So, a lot of the advice that we give are putting in place things like policies, to decide whether we can onboard certain types of customers, whether we can onboard certain types of employees, whether there's a deal point on a commercial deal that we're doing that we need to close off, or there's maybe a privacy point that we need to consider in the rolling out of a product. So what's really, really important when you're doing that in a remote setting is real clarity of information. So coaching people in the team to present really, really clear facts and really, really clear context of what we're discussing. And then what is it that you're looking for? Are you looking for a discussion on this, which is absolutely fine? Are you looking for an answer? Is it A or B or C? And then, I'll either decide that myself, or I'll bring it to the management team, or we'll decide that. I'm also really, really focused on metrics of our team, mainly around speed and efficiency, and trying to reduce the number of tickets that we're looking at, because we have a lot of customer facing exposure where customers are asking questions, and then legal is often the last place that a question goes. And what you don't want is for that question to go there and die in a closet somewhere and be forgotten, because everyone's waiting for the answer from legal. And also we are at risk of being the team that takes the longest to come back on something, because maybe we have to go to this counsel and maybe the customer doesn't agree. So we have to then speak to their counsel, and then it gets really, really complicated. And you've got a really, really long Slack thread or other messaging platform thread of debate. And so as well as just being an escalation point, what I'm trying to do as well is instill really good working practice with the team, so that we're very crisp and we have, competencies within our team around things like brevity, to make sure that we are being really, really efficient with how we're working. Even though we've got all this amazing expertise across different countries, we just want to make sure that we speak our customers' language, internal customers, that is, and external customers. We don't overcomplicate stuff, and we just provide a really, really slick service to the rest of the business. I do a bit of corporate stuff as well when we're doing corporate events, because that's going back to what I did before. And I really like to go to events where I can meet customers and try to pitch remote to people as well. That's a really enjoyable part of the job. But the meat of my day is basically I'm on the messaging, I'm on Slack. There's activity happening the whole time. Some people get really stressed out by it. I have to admit, I get a bit of a buzz. Like every time something comes in, it's interesting, it's nuanced, it's layered. I get to use kind of all the experience I've had to date, kind of analyzing something quickly, sometimes using an AI tool to simplify it for me, and then just like get to make really impactful decisions that hopefully make customers' lives better and help the team as well, and help the team progress and advance.
We've had quite a few clients coming to us asking us, how do we make sure that this is covered in our terms, even though we're not exactly sure what these changes are going to look like. I think one of the key things that's obviously coming up a lot now is the use of AI in financial services. It's important from a DEI perspective to make sure that everyone's included, etc. If people don't have the tools to talk about race comfortably and openly, a lot of those things tend not to be successful. It's definitely more prominently on the agenda for a lot of the big law firms. That's also partly because it's been client driven. Everybody felt the need to kind of assimilate and be like everybody else to be successful, whereas there are a lot more examples now of people who do things differently, who are from different backgrounds, who are successful in law and who have made that their thing.
Welcome to the Legally Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hanna. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Nikki Ogan. Nikki is a senior associate in the global regulatory team at Hogan Lovells in London. She specializes in providing business regulatory advice to businesses in the payments, banking, and lending industry. She has previously completed secondments at the likes of Lloyds Banking Group and HSBC. Nikki is passionate about advancing diversity at Hogan Lovells and is a member of the committee of the Hogan Lovells Black and Minority Ethnic Network. She is also the proud co-founder of the Black Women's Law Network. Nikki volunteers her time to speak and educate individuals at legal careers events in London, focusing on diversity. So a very big warm welcome, Nikki.
Thank you, Rob. Good to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Before we dive into all your amazing projects, experiences to date, we do have a customary icebreaker question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law, if you've seen it, on the scale of 1 to 10?
I would say it depends. That's such a lawyer answer. I would probably give it a 7. I would say maybe 6, 7. I'd say 6, 7. I think if I was a US lawyer, I might give it a different answer. Because obviously a lot of the things that happen on there are quite like US law specific.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think 6, 7. Yeah.
Yeah, 6, 7, fair answer. And with that, let's move swiftly on to talk all about you. So would you mind telling our listeners a bit about your background and career journey?
Yeah, sure. So I am a senior associate at Hogan Lovells. In terms of my background and what I do, so I do regulated financial services law. So primarily advisory law, advising the full spectrum of financial services clients on complying with law and regulation around regulated financial services. When I say financial services clients, that has to be caveated now because we have not just, your typical banking clients, but we have people who are in the fintech space. We have people who actually don't offer financial services as their kind of bread and butter, but they do have an aspect of their business which involves payments, banking, lending. And we're finding a lot of companies do that more now than they used to. So when I say full spectrum, it really is full spectrum. In terms of my journey into law, so I never know how far back to go, but I studied law at the University of Nottingham. That was after a short stint of trying to study economics and changing course. So when I finally left the Uni of Nottingham, I was made an offer to train at Hogan Lovells, which I accepted very happily. That was my first choice of law firm. I then went to BPP Law School. So I did the LPC as it was then. I did the accelerated LPC, so I was only doing it for 6 months. And then I joined my firm in the summer of 2017. So I did 4 seats. I did data protection. I did regulated financial services, which is where I have now qualified. I did a client secondment to Lloyds Banking Group in their consumer finance team. And then finally, I did a seat in financial services litigation. So a very kind of financial services, reg advisory heavy training contract experience. And then, I qualified into my team in 2019. I've been very happily working there since, and then very recently got promoted to senior associate. So that was end of April, so a few months ago. So I'm a very junior senior associate. But yeah, that's kind of like a quick whistle-stop tour of my journey. And obviously we'll go into a bit more detail about specific aspects as we have our chat, but that is me.
For those that are less familiar, you touched on it before. Tell us a little bit more about the regulatory advice, touch on a bit more around the clients and what a typical day looks like for you. I think that'll be super helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, good question. And to be honest, this is one that I try to get across quite a bit, because when you hear about law firms like Hogan Lovells and other similar size firms, people talk a lot about the corporate work, the transactional work, see a lot about disputes, litigation, arbitration, etc. I don't think that reg and advisory work gets the spotlight that some of the other areas of law do. So it's nice to be able to do that. And so essentially the way that I try to describe it to people is that there are a lot of areas of law that are very highly regulated. So, you have the side where a client obviously has to think about, a piece of legislation, other different types of laws that might apply to them. But in terms of how they run day to day, it's not necessarily based on kind of specific legislation or laws. Whereas, in the industries that my clients operate in, there is that angle where they have to also think not only about what law applies to them, but also what a regulator is doing. So what the regulator thinks. In my area, it's mainly the Financial Conduct Authority or the Prudential Regulation Authority. And there are other kind of relevant regulatory bodies as well in the financial services space. And so what that does is it makes the advice that we have to give them quite specific. So not just, okay, this is how you comply with the law, but also the regulator in this space is very focused on the area that you're trying to go into. And these are the things that you need to focus on to make sure that you not only get it right in terms of strict legal compliance, but also making sure that you maintain a good relationship with the regulators, making sure that you don't become a company that's constantly getting into trouble. That kind of thing gives you that extra layer of work to do. And I think that makes the work quite interesting and quite different, I guess, from other things that people might experience when they go into, big law firms like this. And so, as I mentioned, the clients that we work for across the board, there are so many different types, but we've served for a very long time, your very well-known banks, but we're also moving now a lot more into the kind of fintech space. So we actually have a program called the Fintech Mentor Program, where we onboard a cohort of fintech companies every year. And what we do is we provide them with £25,000 worth of free legal advice. So £25,000 each, obviously, not spread between the 10 of them. And what that does is that we get to make sure that up and coming fintech companies who might not always have the budget to spend on big law firms at the kind of early stage get the advice and support that they need to make sure that they're doing things right from the beginning. And it saves them a lot of time and money trying to correct things down the line when they've scaled up and they're looking for investment. And then it turns out that, okay, they haven't really sought the right legal advice early on. So that in that sense, it helps them a lot in terms of getting off the ground in a way that's legally compliant and making sure that it's aligned with what the regulators expect. And it also helps us to kind of learn from them, look at what they're doing, see how they do things differently, and kind of think about how to apply some laws and regulations that have been around for a long time to very new and innovative styles of business. And what happens typically at the end in the happy scenario is that even once their, allocation is finished, they tend to stay with us because we've obviously given them advice from the beginning. We understand their business, how they operate, what the issues are that affect them, and we can continue to kind of maintain that relationship on an ongoing basis. So that's typically what happens with those clients. And then, as I mentioned, there are other clients who are not financial services providers typically, but who are looking at incorporating payments, lending into their day-to-day business. And we are advising those clients as well. And in terms of a day-to-day, so as I said, a lot of the work circulates around giving people advice. And that advice takes lots of different formats. So it could be, preparing a presentation on a new piece of legislation, and explaining to somebody exactly how it's going to impact their business or a specific product that they've launched or are trying to launch. There could be the scenario where there's a question or an issue that's affecting the business and they need a note of advice to tell them exactly what they need to be thinking about, what the potential risks and issues are, laid out in a kind of almost essay style format, which actually is my favorite type of work. We also then have the kind of, looking at new product launches. So advising on that, again, what kind of things do they need to consider if they're moving into a new space? We have what we call, I guess, dealing with not necessarily heat issues, but you do get clients who, for whatever reason, there's been an incident or they may not have complied with a specific piece of regulation or legislation, and they're concerned about what the impact of them on them might be. And in those cases, they might, essentially ring us up in a panic and tell us what's happened and ask us to advise ad hoc. And other times it's more considered and we can sit down with them, give them a real walkthrough of what the potential concerns might be and how to deal with it. So in some cases, they might need to remediate customers, for example, and we guide them through that whole journey. So there's lots of different types of advice that we can give. We also run surgeries. So there are clients who we kind of have an ongoing, it might be a monthly or quarterly call with them. And we ask them to send us in questions about different aspects of law and regulation, and literally we sit on the call, we answer each one. And So giving them the answers over the phone in what we call almost like a surgery. So there are lots of different formats that advice can take. And I suppose a typical day would involve progressing each of those forms of advice. And it gives me a good mix between doing work by myself. So sometimes the advice is something that, I can do the research, I can answer the question one-on-one, and I don't need anybody else to kind of get involved or help me. And there are other times where it's a big project. If we're doing a big review of terms and conditions, for example, that's where you would typically have, more team members involved, from, trainee all the way up to partner. And there is a good mix of work in that sense. So I think I'm pretty much evenly split between work that I'm usually doing with other people, and then work that I might kind of be running almost independently. So yeah, the typical day, I guess there isn't really one, but I would be doing different things to progress each of those pieces of advice basically on a day-to-day basis. So it's having internal calls with the team if we're working as a team on a specific piece of work. It might be a call with the client to give them a piece of advice over the phone. A lot of it will be time spent kind of progressing the matters, just working on them, building up the advice note, preparing the presentation, or preparing for a workshop with the client, whatever it might be. So it's a mixture of those different tasks. And then obviously, spending time doing things which are not necessarily chargeable work, but which still help to develop the business of the team and the firm. And so there's that kind of aspect of things, which I would also spending at least, I would say like half an hour to an hour, depending on the day, but doing work which is not chargeable, but which is important for business development. So, yeah.
In some ways it's challenging to be a lawyer at an organisation which is not primarily a legal organisation, because you are kind of, as I said, a small cog in a much bigger machine. Part of my job as a lawyer within a campaigning human rights organisation is to look at new legislation and think about whether or not it's compatible with existing human rights protection. The last 4 years has seen huge swathes of new legislation designed to kind of limit protest rights. So from creating new criminal offences to broadening police powers to limit protests. But there are other ways in which the police have been handed greater powers, for example, to control static demos rather than just marches. They now have the power to place limits on those as well. Protest rights are respected, and that people do have the right to demonstrate and to make their voices heard on the issues that they believe in.
Welcome to the Legally Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hanna. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Katie Watts. Katie is a solicitor at the human rights organisation Liberty. Katie leads its legal work on protests and works across technology, surveillance and data rights. Katie has been leading the case against the Home Secretary over protest laws. Before joining Liberty in 2020, Katie worked at a leading public law NGO and the Public Law Project, where she specialised in strategic judicial review litigation concerning access to justice and migrants' rights. So, a very big warm welcome, Katie.
Hi Rob, very glad to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. And before we dive into all your amazing projects and experience to date, we do have a customary icebreaker question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law, if you've seen it?
Well, I haven't seen it, so I'm not sure I can answer that question.
So with that, we're going to give it a quick 0 and move swiftly on to talk all about you. So to begin with, Katie, would you mind telling our listeners a bit more about your background and career journey?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you said at the outset, I'm a solicitor at Liberty, which is a human rights organisation. And before that, I worked at the Public Law Project, which is another NGO. So in lots of ways, it's been quite an unusual career journey in that I've never been a solicitor in private practice. I've always worked in the NGO sector, trained and qualified at the Public Law Project, as well as working there for 4 years post-qualification. And before that, I worked in the NGO sector as a non-lawyer. So it's a bit of an unusual journey. I didn't go down the kind of traditional training contract route.
Yeah, and we like people with different backgrounds, and it also opens people's eyes to different routes into the law as well, which I think is great. But talk us through some of your sort of motivations. What motivated you specifically to pursue a career in human rights, justice and migrants' rights?
It's a good question. I think, so I studied politics as an undergraduate, and I looked at law when I was coming to the end of my undergraduate degree as something that felt like perhaps a kind of natural career move. It sort of fits quite well. Politics and the law often go together. And I sort of had an idea then that I wanted to do something that would be sort of practically useful, I suppose. And so I did do a law conversion immediately after my undergraduate degree, and I actually found it extremely off-putting and really didn't enjoy it at all. And part of the reason for that, I think, was not so much the kind of content of the law conversion, but just the sort of narrowness, I guess, of the kind of careers that I was able to find out about through that experience. It felt very geared towards funneling students towards careers at the sort of corporate end of the legal profession, so magic circle firms, commercial firms. And I kind of looked into those kinds of training contracts. It really didn't feel like it was for me. It felt much harder to access information about like what other kinds of legal careers might look like. And so I ended up not pursuing law at the end of that process. I kind of opted out of a legal career. I didn't think it was necessarily forever, but I went and did a variety of different jobs working for kind of charities, including the British Red Cross, where I worked with refugees and migrants, and at a social justice charity called Toynbee Hall. And it was through doing that kind of work in the like charity and NGO sector where I felt very at home, but I also started to be exposed to lawyers who were practicing in those fields through lawyers who came and volunteered at projects that I was working on, or just often, especially with the work at the Red Cross, we would often need to refer service users to lawyers to take up their cases when they were experiencing kind of really significant legal problems. And so that really opened my eyes to the kinds of firms that were doing the work that I was interested in, and the kind of legal career that I had sort of initially imagined when I thought about doing a law conversion, and that just felt much more suited to what I wanted to do than those kind of commercial firms and commercial training contracts that had been the focus, I guess, of the careers advice I'd had at an earlier point.
I want to kind of just dive a little bit deeper into this because in a Liberty article, and this flows nicely from what you were just saying, says court finds government anti-protest legislation unlawful after Liberty legal challenge. You state, in recent years, the government has introduced a whole host of new laws which have tried to stop people from being able to speak up for what they believe in. So how have these laws affected people's ability to organise and participate in protests?
I would say that there have been two main impacts from the new laws which have been introduced. The first is handing the police greater powers to place limits and place controls on protests. As I said, that's what our case was about trying to ensure that the threshold at which police can interfere in protests was not lowered further. But there are other ways in which the police have been handed greater powers, for example, to control static demos rather than just marches. They now have power to place limits on those as well. But the new legislation has also introduced a range of new criminal offences. I think one of the notable examples of that is the offence of locking on or being equipped to lock on, which is an offence which comprises of attaching yourself or an object to another object, to another person, to land. And that was used to arrest anti-monarchy protesters at the coronation last year who had arrived for their protest with their placards zip-tied together, and the existence of those zip ties was apparently being equipped to lock on. So we've seen these really kind of broad, concerning offences, which I think can be used by the police, potentially to arrest and criminalise protesters. But I think it's also created an atmosphere really of uncertainty about what the law is regarding protest, because as well as the introduction of all of these new laws, there's been a huge amount of rhetoric from the government and from the police around protest. I think what that has led to is uncertainty by people about, you know, to what extent protest is lawful, what kinds of protest offences there are, whether they may be criminalised for attending a protest. And that's really concerning.
Yeah, it is. And that, again, leads to what I was going to want to find out a little bit more from you on how do these laws conflict with existing human rights protections in the UK?
So I think that was something that we've been thinking about over the last few years as each of these new pieces of legislation is introduced to Parliament. Part of my job as a lawyer within a campaigning human rights organisation is to look at new legislation and think about whether or not it's compatible with existing human rights protections, and in particular with Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The kind of conclusion that we have come to is that a lot of the kind of where it comes to the crunch is how those laws are used by the police. So creating new criminal offences per se does not necessarily breach Articles 10 and 11 of the Human Rights Act, of the European Convention, is incorporated by the Human Rights Act. But if they are used in a disproportionate way by the police to criminalise protesters who are exercising their right to free expression, then the exercise of those powers may well conflict with human rights law, and that it is likely, I think, that people are being criminalised in ways which engage and potentially breach their right to protest. You've also seen this with things like the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol. Those protesters relied on their human rights in defence of the charges of criminal damage, and were successful in being acquitted. And what happened after that was the then Attorney General, Suella Braverman, referred that case to the Court of Appeal to try to limit the scope of what we call human rights defences, so relying on your human rights in defence in criminal proceedings. And so as well as new legislation which creates new criminal offences, gives the police greater powers to interfere in protests, we're also seeing kind of slightly insidious sort of creeping in of limits on how people can rely on their human rights in criminal proceedings through cases like the Colston 4 Attorney General's reference.
Yeah, no, interesting. Again, thanks for giving lots of case studies that a lot of people will be able to kind of think back to and understand. Let's look forward then. What potential changes or reforms would you like to see to ensure protection of free speech and protest rights in the UK?
I think one thing that I'm particularly concerned about is you've just used the language of free speech. In the UK, we have the right to free expression under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think it's really important to remember that expressive acts can also be acts of protest and also attract the protection of human rights law. And I was just talking about the Colston 4 and that act of tearing down that statue of the, offensive slave trader. And I think what we're seeing at the moment really is a narrowing of what we understand by free expression to kind of a more pure free speech interpretation. And one thing that I would like to see is to kind of hold the line or even expand what we understand as free expression to not just speech, but also to those expressive acts of protest, which might encompass behaviour and actions beyond speech. I think we would also like to see a lot of the legislation that has come into force over the last four years reversed. As I've said, part of the problem is how that legislation is used by the police, how those powers are used. But I think also, as I've said, it has created an atmosphere of uncertainty for protesters. And I think that a sort of strong signal that protest rights are respected and that people do have the right to demonstrate and to make their voices heard on the issues that they believe in, is very important, and that the reversal of some of the more draconian measures that have been introduced over the last few years, some of the new criminal offences, some of the new powers to place civil orders on protesters, which kind of prevent them from engaging in protests, moves to reverse those would, I think, send a very strong signal.
The average person does not have access to high quality legal advice unless they are lucky enough to find a lawyer who acts pro bono. Surely there must be a technological solution that that could help to equalize this problem, because it is ultimately a question of scale. The scale of lawyers who are able to give advice to individuals is simply not big enough to match the whole public need for this. There is a tendency to take a legal first approach and then find an AI wrapper solution to solve that. But that doesn't give you a long-term, credible scientific or technological moat. It makes you highly replicable in the future. The main challenge I faced was I had this idea to build an AI company that helped solve this access to justice issue, but you have to get a very good team in place to do that.
On today's Legally Speaking podcast episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Alexander Kardos-Nieheim, founder and CEO of SafeSign Technologies, a company specializing in the development of the world's best proprietary legal large language model, built by a leading team from Cambridge and Harvard. Alexander studied law at Cambridge University and recently completed his training contract at A&O Sherman. While at university, he also founded the Cambridge Journal of Law, Politics and Art. He's passionate about legal advocacy, policy reform, AI and legal tech. So a very big warm welcome, Alexander.
Real pleasure to be here, Rob.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And before we dive into all your amazing projects, experiences to date, we do have a customary icebreaker question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law on the scale of 1 to 10, only if you've seen it?
It's an interesting one. Now, as someone who hasn't seen it, I can say that I know many people who went into law having watched it. And I think regardless of how reflective Suits is of what law has been so far, the sheer number of people who go into the law thinking it's like Suits may mean that the law ends up actually being like that, because so many people have gone into it thinking it's going to be like it. So, and I must say, you do get quite a few personalities at these law firms who could do a whole TV show of their own. So.
I think that's a great perspective, great answer. And with that, we're going to move swiftly on to talk all about you. So to begin with, you have a very impressive background having studied law at Cambridge University. Can you share a bit about your experience there and how it shaped your career journey thus far?
Yeah, of course. For me, I never really wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't one of those people who grew up having that as a dream. I was always more interested in history and classics. And it was only as a result of a legal battle I fought as a teenager during my GCSEs that I thought actually law might be the thing for me. And just in summary, my mother and I lived in this sadly old, derelict, but, well, I wouldn't quite say derelict, but characterful building in South London, which came under threat from a very large development project. And we thought, well, my mother owned the place, we should be able to fend this off quite easily. But the law had been designed in such a way that smaller communities struggle to fight these bigger development companies. And at the same time, we struggled to afford legal assistance, and found that unless you can afford a lawyer, and a good one, you're in a bit of trouble when you're faced with a legal challenge like this. And that, for me, that very difficult period in my teenage years where I was juggling my GCSEs and A-levels with this big legal fight, basically having to defend my community on my own, showed me that the law can be a very powerful thing if you have a purpose and if you work hard at it. But also, secondly, it showed me that there's a real access to justice issue in the UK and in I would say around the world. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that a little later on. But that then made me want to study law at university. And I, having proposed some law reforms to the House of Lords and to the Mayor of London relating to the protection of communities facing these development challenges, on that basis, I read law at Trinity College, Cambridge. A very it wasn't an easy time. And again, I was always more interested in more the historical side of things. So the law forcing me to think in straight lines as opposed to swirly lines that I tend to think in was always a little bit of a baptism of fire. But that time at Cambridge laid the foundations of much of what we'll talk about in terms of my activities today.
Yeah, and congratulations on that, and we are going to talk about that. But I think it comes from your story of your why is coming from a place of really trying to help. And something here on the Legally Speaking podcast and our sponsor Clio, we support access to justice, and we want to use legal technology and platforms like this to reduce that gap. And interestingly, you mentioned the House of Lords. I was recently at an event actually at the House of Lords with Dana Denise Smith, who's doing some incredible work from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective, and with Oblig's support, and being one of the first B Corp focused legal businesses. And I think the more and more of these minds that can come together to do good, particularly with what you're doing as well, I think hopefully we will actually achieve what is absolutely necessary. But I want to kind of step back to your sort of Cambridge days or around that time, because in 2020 you founded the Cambridge Journal Law of Politics and Art, which attracted attention from pretty notable figures, the likes of Lord Sumption and Lady Ardern. So what inspired you to create that journal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, and this risks going into the realm of politics, but I found that increasingly law and politics are becoming intertwined, sometimes not appropriately. So because of the challenging political times we live in, we find ourselves going more and more to the law to try and hold our politicians accountable, or indeed some might say as a political device in itself. And that very difficult collision and interaction of these two fields I found very interesting, because as a lawyer, you're taught to think, that the law is a body of rules that must retain their integrity and that cannot be influenced by political factors or mob rule or whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, we find that these two things are becoming very intertwined. So that was one motivation. And I think another motivation was that there is, I think, and this applies on all sides of the political spectrum, less common ground. We find ourselves in camps, and I was trying to create a forum where people of totally different views could come together, and as long as they express themselves in a respectful way, we will give them the scope to say exactly what they want. And this is why, as you mentioned, we had the likes of Lord Sumption, who was arguing quite strongly against lockdowns and various measures taken during COVID. But at the same time, we had people from the other side of the debate, very senior decision makers, saying actually, well, these measures were required. And it's not in too many publications that you can actually see both sides of the picture. And that I found very interesting. And much to my surprise, a lot of quite senior people in society also agreed with that. And the journal today has a life of its own. It's distributed in over 80 countries around the world, read by a very wide audience, and hopefully providing a forum where people can find some scope for common ground, even in these very divided times.
It's so important that you stress the importance, of some of those points, particularly you're talking about the robustness, the reliability, because what you are is what you say on the tin, which is safe sign. So it shows that you are putting deep thought to protect the people that are using the platform for good. So I think it was a fantastic answer. And I want to talk about, every entrepreneurial story sounds great, but, there's challenges along the way. So, I'd love to, and you're kind of touching on there, but, just some of the raw, struggles you perhaps and challenges you had to do. What was the process of building Safe Sign like from idea to reality, and what are some of those early challenges you face, and maybe some you're continuing to experience as you grow and move forward?
Yeah, of course. I think I've always been quite open about the challenges. I had no business background. I was fresh out of university, it was a tough journey. As anyone who starts a business goes through this phase, you start with the initial excitement. You have an idea. It seems so perfect. You think, oh, how can this not, succeed? And then you start to do a bit of digging and you think, oh no, someone already does something similar. And then you go past that and you think, well, right, there's a competitive landscape here. Can we set ourselves apart and try to do something unique? And that's all very well. You can plan this out on paper beautifully. But then when it comes to implementation, that's, I think, where the biggest difficulties are. And I think the main challenge I faced was that I had this idea to build an AI company that helped solve this access to justice issue, but you have to get a very good team in place to do that. And the AI world is so competitive from a recruitment perspective, and it is so capital intensive that there are huge expectations of salary and the like if you really want the top people. And I really did want the top people. But lacking investment from an early stage or any serious investment, I had to go I had to rely on people's basically goodwill and guts to get involved with someone who's never started a business before, who is very likely to make loads of mistakes. And I needed people who were okay with a bit of a roller coaster ride. So what ended up happening was we got this remarkable collection of Cambridge law professors, Cambridge AI scientists, Harvard and MIT AI researchers, a team that you would usually think would be almost impossible to bring in at this sort of stage of a company. But through, I think, a really common sense of purpose, we thought, right, we are going to not look at other opportunities for the time being. Of course, we can go off and do other things. But this access to justice issue and our approach that we were taking, not just to the legal problem of access to justice, but the AI problems that we're dealing with here of safety, robustness, reliability, data quality, that is something that for an AI researcher is relevant for the whole of the AI industry. Law is simply one domain in which you can try to deal with some of those issues. So we had a very motivated team, and a team that was willing to take risks, and a team that ultimately trusted me, even through times when, frankly, I didn't trust myself. So there was the team element, and then and if it wasn't for the team, of course, we would not have made it. But from a personal perspective, as I mentioned, I was juggling a training contract at Allen & Overy Sherman, as it is now. I had joined A&O, the legacy A&O company, and I wanted to be a good trainee as well as a successful entrepreneur. So it was very much a matter of not letting the two worlds collide. So A&O working hours, like many law firms, are quite tough. So I would wake up at maybe 4 or 5 in the morning to start work on SafeSign, work on that until until the minute I had to leave my flat to go to work. Then I'd work for A&O up until lunchtime. My lunch break would be taken up with SafeSign again, then back to A&O up until however late it needed to be. And then any time I had in the middle of the night, I would spend back on SafeSign. And it was that on repeat for 2 years. And that was very personally challenging. And you can imagine, the number of friends I sort of didn't reply to for months on end and all the rest of it. And then combined with that, of course, the energy strains is the emotional strain when you have what became quite a capital intensive company. Eventually we had to have a salary team, we had to incur large computing costs. And from month to month, having to think, right, I am the one that 14 people are relying on for their paycheck at the end of the month, but I'm also doing this research exercise for this partner as a trainee, and trying to separate those two worlds and stay productive in both of them. It was a bit of a challenge. And then from an investment perspective, just in terms of, I think, the final big challenge, we never actually got institutional funding. We operated on angel investment for the whole life of the company. And the first time we tried to pursue venture capital funding, we ended up getting acquired. So I think from a funding perspective, we had quite an unusual journey. But the motivating thing for me, and what I would say to other people who might be afraid of multitasking like I did, or who might think, the investment challenges are too great. If you simply put one foot in front of the other for long enough and keep your wits together, you give yourself a chance to succeed. And if you have a very good team as well that can deal with this sort of risk and volatility, then I think you're very well placed.
Today's episode is brought to you by Clio, hosts of the annual Clio Cloud Conference. Better known as ClioCon, it's the biggest conference in legal and an opportunity that every legal professional should take advantage of.
This year, CleoCon is headed to the iconic city of Boston, Massachusetts on October the 16th and 17th. A city steeped in legal history and renowned for its culture of innovation, Boston is the perfect setting for this incredible event. And right now is the perfect time to buy your passes before prices go up at the end of February. Join thousands of legal professionals, thought leaders, and industry experts to network and cover the latest legal trends, gain groundbreaking insights, and learn practical strategies to elevate your practice. Whether it's mastering marketing techniques, streamlining your workflows, or enhancing client relationships, CleoCon offers actionable insights that make a real difference. Pass prices will never be this low again, so act now. Visit CleoCloudConference.com to secure your pass today. Now back to the show.
I love being the managing partner of this firm. And one of the reasons is there is no typical day. It's a really exciting time for new lawyers to join the legal profession because we're on the cusp of so much change. And I think that's going to be a very good thing for more junior lawyers. Law firms are talent businesses, right? We don't have factories or warehouses. We don't have anything that we are, quote, selling other than the talents and experience and judgment of our people. One of my jobs as managing partner, and the jobs of our senior partners, is to help the next generation fall in love with what we do with our organization. In many ways, we are overdue for significant change. And now we're in the early days of significant change. I think that's exciting. I think we should embrace that.
On today's episode of the Legally Speaking podcast, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Michael Gerstenzang. Michael attended Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and completed his JD at Columbia Law School. He joined Cleary Gottlieb Stephen Hamilton in 1992 and was made partner in 1999. In 2017, Michael was elected managing partner, described by Chambers Global 2018 as a very strategic thinker who can navigate difficult issues and bring a lot of experience to the table. Michael focuses on private investment funds, private equity funds, infrastructure funds, and different types of alternative investment vehicles. He also has experience advising investment firms and founders on succession and management reorganization issues. Michael, named Listener-in-Chief, is dedicated to meeting the needs of clients and strengthening the firm's position as a global leader in providing innovative, pragmatic advice in complex situations. So, a very big warm welcome, Michael.
Rob, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute honor to have you on the show. And before we dive into all your amazing projects and experiences today, we do have a customary icebreaker question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law if you've seen it?
Okay. Well, I'm a little bit ashamed to say that I haven't seen it, but my impression is that it is much more interesting than the average day of a lawyer at any big law firm. My embarrassment at not having seen Suits is really twofold. One, I watch a lot of TV, and most of it is pretty lowbrow, and I think Suits should definitely be on my watch list, and I got to remedy that. The second is there's actually, at least in the lore of our firm, a pretty strong connection between the show Suits and Cleary Gottlieb. So a longtime Cleary partner, who's now a federal judge in New York, is a fellow named Louis Lyman. His brother is Doug Lyman, who is one of the forces behind the show Suits, as well as a number of other TV shows and movies. And for those who watch the show Suits, you'll know that one of the lead characters in the show is called Louis Litt, which people around here like to think maybe is a connection to our former colleague Louis Lyman. I don't know if that's true or not, but it makes it even worse that I haven't seen the show.
Well, you say worse. I think that's one of the most interesting answers we've ever had in connection for someone who's actually never seen it. So with that, we're going to give it a 0 and move swiftly on to talk all about you, Michael. So would you mind by kicking off telling our listeners a bit about your background and career journey?
Sure. So I grew up in Albany, New York, small city. My mom taught third grade. My stepfather, with whom I grew up, repaired trucks, heavy duty trucks for a living. It was a very middle class upbringing, had no involvement in big law, in finance, really in anything of that sort. But went to college at Georgetown University in Washington, went to law school at Columbia Law School in New York. And through those experiences, started thinking about the world in broader terms and became attracted to the idea of being a lawyer, mostly because it felt like a profession where you got to do lots of different things, and it combined both an academic orientation and a business orientation, and those two things appealed to me. So I graduated from Columbia Law School. I had two clerkships. The first was for a judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals here in New York. That was 18 months, and then I went abroad and lived in The Hague in the Netherlands and clerked for a judge on the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal and did that for a little over a year. And then came back to New York and joined Cleary Gottlieb Benn after these clerkships. And my experience at Cleary has been absolutely tremendous. I've been at the firm for about 34 years. It's been a fascinating journey through lots of different client work and different roles at the firm, and I'm more than happy to talk to you about that today.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at how we're both dressed today, I'm sure it was suit and tie and jacket and not open collar back then, and no AI and all of these things. Like it's the only constant in business is change. But I would like to go back to the clerkships, if I may, because they're super impressive, and I always think experiences you get early on in your career really help shape and mold how you go on to the future. So, what did you particularly learn that you found useful in those particular clerkships?
Yeah, I found both of the clerkships incredibly interesting and valuable. And that's for somebody who pretty much knew I did not want to do litigation in my practice. And so it was a little bit of an odd choice, perhaps, for somebody who was more interested in corporate to not just do one clerkship, but two. But at the time and looking back, I felt like I learned a tremendous amount about the law. I learned a tremendous amount about thinking analytically and writing in a very clear and crisp and concise way. So I got a tremendous amount from both of them. And one of the lessons that I've since carried with me is, of course, the clerkship is very much about a close relationship with the judge. And I was incredibly fortunate to work for two terrific judges who really took time and interest in mentoring their clerks. But it was also about learning and developing relationships with my co-clerks. And looking back on it, I feel like I often learned just as much from my co-clerks, even though we were peers within the chambers, as I did from the judges. I think that's an important life lesson. There are lots of people you can learn from. It's not always the person who's more senior than you. It can be the person who is your peer or somebody who's junior to you. But the clerkships were great. The second one at the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal was also my first opportunity to live abroad, to live outside the United States. And that was a tremendous experience, both professionally and personally. And it kind of opened my eyes to kind of internationalism that's been an important part of my career and my life since then, and made me interested in doing another stint abroad, which I ended up doing with Cleary a few years after that. So I think regardless of what you think your long-term professional interests are, it's certainly worth considering a clerkship.
Yeah, and some great nuggets in there as well. And I always advise people to get out of their comfort zone. The comfort zone's great, but nothing ever grows there. You went abroad, you got new experiences, you acquired things. And then, I always talk about the importance of having a 360 mentorship, board of directors, people beneath you, around you, to the side of you that can learn and be a sponge. So yeah, really good wisdom shared there. Thank you. So let's get to Cleary then. 1992 comes along. You join the firm. You specialize in private equity, private funds, seed investment, joint ventures. There's not a lot you haven't done in this sort of space in terms of general partner management company arrangement. So would you mind, for people less familiar, we've got people from all different directions in terms of interest in the law who listen to the show, explaining a little bit more about the areas you cover and the work that you do?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I feel really fortunate to have come into private equity work really in the earliest days of that industry. And it's given me a kind of front row seat and often involved directly in work and the development of the private equity business that frankly nobody could have imagined in 1992 and 1993. Including working on the very first fund that TPG raised in 1993 and working with them and continuing to work with them now over several decades. But private equity firms essentially raise money mostly from institutional investors, from endowments and pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and the like, and then invest that money. Could be buying a company, could be investing in other kinds of assets, with the goal of increasing the value of the company, improving their operations, helping guide them strategically, and then selling the assets some years later and returning the profits to their investors, which people call limited partners. It's a very entrepreneurial business, a very dynamic business, and has become an important part of the commercial landscape on a global basis because of the size of private equity firms and alternative asset managers more generally, in the role that they play in M&A and in capital markets and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on it before, but maybe you just want to put you on the spot a little bit, because you have represented some of the biggest funds in the world, from Blackstone to KKR. You mentioned the TPG Capital Management one in 1993. Is there a particular one that's been most memorable for you that you would like to share with us, or tell us a little bit more about that TPG one, if that was?
You know, when I think about the experiences I've had working for clients, and again, I feel incredibly fortunate to have gotten involved in this work in the earliest days, and for the client relationships that I've had, that some of the most memorable client work really was because of developments either in the private equity business or in the world that forced both investors and private equity firms to adapt. And so, you know, part of that was a dramatic increase in the size of private equity funds. You know, from funds in the mid 90s, it would be a big fund if you had $1 billion or $1.5 billion, and just, you know, 5 or 6 years later, it was 10 and 12 and $14 billion. And that changes the way that funds get raised and the nature of the relationship with investors. Then you had the really enormous LBOs, $30, $40 billion LBOs in 2005, 2008, and that led to other changes in the way that deals were structured and money was raised for those deals, co-investment opportunities for limited partners, which has now become a very common thing, but was new at the time. The global financial crisis and forcing both private equity firms and limited partners to rethink their relationships and how the money was being deployed and in what pace and so on. And the changes just continue. We've, at our firm, had an important role on succession issues as the founding generation of large private equity firms begin to move off stage and are succeeded by the next generation. Dealing with liquidity issues, both for private equity firms themselves, many of which have gone public, or for portfolio companies. So it's been a journey marked by change and adaptability and by entrepreneurship. Some of the most memorable moments, though, for me, really are about the teams and working with the people at the clients and the Cleary Gottlieb people, and really rallying around and getting smart, dedicated, hardworking people to focus on complicated problems and come up with novel solutions. And there's no better feeling than that. You know, sitting around a room and brainstorming about things and coming up with an answer which wasn't immediately apparent, and then figuring out how you're going to implement that answer. Those moments are memorable and deeply satisfying, both intellectually and personally. So, as I said, I feel incredibly fortunate and also very lucky, and I think that's worth underscoring, because I think it's all together too easy for successful people to forget the role that luck has played in their success. I feel incredibly lucky to have gotten involved in the private equity industry in its earliest days and to have developed long-term relationships. And I feel incredibly lucky for the people I've gotten to work with at Clear Gottlieb along this journey.
Yeah, and I couldn't love that answer more. I was just nodding away, listening to everything there. And, I was always told we is greater than me. And absolutely, if you can build these teams and you can strive for great things together and, you're a part of that as a leader, I think there's nothing more intrinsically valuable than seeing that. And as you say, and I can see how you've been so successful in your career with just the mindset and the way that you're coming across today, because you talk about entrepreneurialism, you talk about adaptability. These are things you have to really focus on as we particularly move in this, once in a species, not once in a revolution opportunity within the AI world that we are. So, I'm really enjoying learning about the sort of trajectory and the way that you've sort of seen your career go. With that, you touched on before that you'd had some international experiences. I'd just like to take you back to the time in Brussels, because you spent 2 years in your Brussels office, I think between 1994 and 1996. So what did you most enjoy about your time abroad, and how did that help you in terms of shaping you as a global lawyer coming back to the US?
I think there were a couple of things that really stuck with me from that time. One is the people that I got to work with in our Brussels office, which is an incredibly international, diverse office, and that's been true for decades. We had lawyers from all over Europe, and at that time, it was the early days of the post-Soviet era in Eastern Europe. And so we had young lawyers from Poland, from Hungary, from Romania working with us in our office for a year or two, and just being exposed to these really bright, energetic people who came from a completely different background than me, a different cultural background, a different educational background, and learning from and with them was incredibly enriching. I think the work that I was doing at that time, and a lot of it was influenced by the privatizations that were going on in Eastern Europe at the time, that was also really interesting. It was a moment of adaptation for those businesses, for those countries, for the legal systems. And I think living through a time of adaptation was very valuable for me, and it instilled in me excitement, actually, about adaptation that has carried with me to today. And Rob, you mentioned generative AI. We're very focused on that here at the firm, and we're embracing it in a very positive way. I did a presentation at one of our partner meetings recently and put up a quote that was, when the winds of change start to blow, some people build walls and some people build windmills, and we're a firm that's building windmills. And I think I have that feeling and optimism about change because of my experience in Brussels and because of my experience in the private equity industry. I think change is can be a very positive thing if you embrace it with a positive spirit.
Welcome to the Legally Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hanna. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Angela Denning. Angela studied at Trinity College and is a qualified barrister. She also has IPA training in strategy and training. Angela has a wealth of experience in the court services in the probate office and as a deputy master of the High Court. Angela also spent time dealing with the Freedom of Information Request and whistleblowing legislation at the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Angela was appointed Chief Executive of the Court Service in 2019. So, a very big warm welcome, Angela.
Thanks very much, Rob. Good to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Super excited for today's chat. But before we go through all your amazing experiences, we do have a little customary question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law, if you've seen it?
The shoes are the right height. The ladies' shoes are the right height. Other than that, no, it's not very real.
So fashion 10, law 0. And with that, yeah, we're going to move swiftly on to talk all about you. So to begin with, Angela, would you mind telling our listeners a bit about your background and career journey?
Well, when I finished in school, I went to Trinity College to do computer science. Then I left college at the time of a recession in Ireland, so everybody went on the dole, as I did, and I went off and did desktop publishing. So I worked for it was called Buy and Sell, Ireland's free ads paper at the time, like small ads where people could sell their cars and all that kind of thing. Worked for them for a bit. And then I got a job in the civil service at the end of 1995. And I came to work in the High Court in the largest public office in the High Court, which is the central office where you take in all the civil documents for all the cases. So I was there a couple of years, and I was sent to the King's Inns to do law at night, qualified as a barrister. At that stage, I'd moved to the probate office. My job there was personal applications. So instead of using a lawyer to do probate after somebody had died, you came in to do the application yourself. And I still say that was my favourite job, the most rewarding job, because I was dealing directly with people, and you got to deal with them from start to finish. So from the day they rang up to say, can I have an application form, until they left the office with their grant of probate. So it was a really rewarding job, and I loved that. I had finished the Inns at that stage, and I got promoted again. So I was sent back to where I came from, and I went back to the High Court as a registrar. And I was registrar to the Master of the High Court for a few years, which is a really busy list. It's all the procedural work to do with the High Court, the civil list. So I learned a lot there. And then I got promoted again, and I went to the non-jury list, the non-jury judicial review list. So I was kind of list manager there for a long number of years. And then I was appointed Deputy Master of the High Court. And I did that for probably 6 years. Really, really enjoyable. Great fun every day. I know they called me Judge Judy. The practitioners called me Judge Judy, but yeah, it was great fun. I suppose the background that I had coming from that administrative side of the work, it made it easy for me, because I knew the procedures very well. I knew the paperwork very well. And then from my perspective, it was all about moving cases along, because you're very conscious that while people see a bundle of files on a desk, actually there's a family or a person behind every one of those. So it's about moving those cases along and trying to eliminate delay in cases. And then I got a little bit bored, and I suppose my brain had kind of stopped working almost at that stage. After a period of time doing the same thing, I decided to go back to college again, and I did a master's in leadership and strategy at that stage. So that kind of, gave me a different perspective on things. And I thought, God, I want to do something different here. And I'd applied for to move internally within the court service, but that wasn't available. So I took the jump and I left, and I went to that evil department of public expenditure and reform. So it's the department in Ireland that gives out the money or not, and certainly the department that holds everybody to account for the money that's spent on public services in Ireland. So I went up there, and that was all about the job up there was all about government reform, so lobbying, ethics, freedom of information, open data sharing. And when I kind of looked afterwards and thought, well, what's the common thread here? It was all about public trust in government. So it was all of the functions that kind of would give the public trust in government, and how government dealt with them and with their money and so on. So that was really, really interesting. I absolutely loved that job. I was there for about a year and a half, and then the job was advertised CEO of the court service, and I was lucky enough to get to be appointed. I was at a judge's retirement a couple of weeks ago, and she said she had the best job in Ireland, and I thought to myself, no, you're wrong. I think I have. I'm really lucky to be here, and it's a great job. You can kind of change the world every day.
And richly deserved. And just listening through there of everything that you've achieved, I'm just so proud that we've managed to get you on the show to kind of unpack all that wisdom, because you've had so many tremendous roles that you say you've thoroughly enjoyed. And a large part of what we're trying to create on the Legally Speaking podcast is to try and inspire people to have more fulfilling legal careers and get the information that they need to hopefully make better educated career decisions. So on that then, in terms of giving people an understanding who might be less familiar with the Irish court system, could you explain a little bit how that works in Ireland, and perhaps some of the key differences from the court system in England and Wales, if at all?
I would think there are very few differences. The law is the same, pretty much. It's interchangeable almost. Scale is different. So we have 1,269 staff across about 51 offices nationwide. Very diverse in terms of population size. So Dublin Metropolitan District, the city, is 1.3 million people. Kilronan in the Aran Islands is a couple of hundred people, but we have to have court there 3 or 4 times a year. So like a very diverse population, areas of the country that are poorly served in terms of, just geography is difficult. And then Ireland, I suppose, has changed so much over the last number of years. The last census tells us that 750,000 people, so we've a population of 5.2 million now, which has grown significantly in the last 20 years. 750,000 people don't speak English or Irish at home. So for us, that's a challenge, just in terms of people's understanding, and I suppose where we are. The court service, we do the administrative side. So as I say, we get the judges, we do everything until the point where the judge sits on the bench. The judge takes over at that stage, and as soon as the judge walks off the bench, we take over again. So we do all the list preparation, the staff, the management, the administration, provide the buildings, provide all the services that go along with it, because court isn't just about what goes on in the courtroom, it's everything around it. And I suppose if I look back, we were probably underfunded for a large number of years. The money that did come went into buildings. That was very necessary. The average age of an Irish courthouse is 162 years. There's a fact for Trivial Pursuit sometime into the future. Very old buildings. It's usually, the large imposing building on the main street of a town. Everybody wants to keep those buildings, but they're very difficult to manage. They're difficult to repair. They're costly. They're all grade 1 listed. So you have all of that along with it. And then, of course, user expectations nowadays are different. We have a large population of people who in the last census said that they had disabilities, for example. Providing access to those people to court is difficult, particularly if you think of the old courthouse with, 50 steps up the front. Courthouses 150 or 200 years ago weren't built to be accessible. They were built to be imposing. And I suppose that's the challenge that we have now, that people's expectations are different. So, I would say in terms of the law, it's kind of the same. We have 193 judges as of today. That'll probably increase again. So there's a programme of work underway at the moment. The Judicial Planning Working Group reported last year, and there was a recommendation for a 25% increase in judges over the course of 2 years. So the first tranche of judges arrived the end of 2023, and we're expecting another 20 this year. So of course that expansion of court work means that everything we do expands. It's very much demand driven, the work we do. So if this year, you never know what the work is going to be about. Crime kind of stays steady, family law is growing somewhat, but you never know where the peaks and troughs are going to come from. We very much react to what's going on in society. So if somebody makes a dodgy branded car, everybody's going to be suing because of those cars in 3 years' time. It's that simple.
Yeah, and things going through my head of all the diesel emissions as well, and all of those interesting cases. Okay, it's fair to say no 2 days are the same. It's a huge role that you have, but think back to when you were first appointed Chief Executive of Courts of Service. What did you set out to address? And, holding yourself accountable, how do you feel you are performing against that?
I suppose it was almost easy for me, and I don't say that lightly. The court service had been the subject of a capability review the Department of Public Expenditure had conducted. So it was a review to see how the service was structured and how it dealt with the demands. And there were some pretty awful findings in that report. The main one being that technology had been underfunded and was not fit for purpose. So, for example, we couldn't have done this 4 years ago. The technology, I don't think, would have stood up to it. When I took over, our IT landscape, if you want to call it that, was pretty poor. We had been underfunded for a large number of years. So the first thing I looked at was the structure of the management team. and what we needed in order to deliver for the future. So I restructured there, hired a chief information officer, and set about then putting a proper structure in place for our IT. And that's been the I suppose my main challenge for the last 4 years, and I would say also the main success. You know, in a way, I was unlucky, but also lucky. COVID hit within 6 months of me getting the job. It kind of took the fear out of me in the beginning. I think I did have that kind of fear. Oh God, why did they give me this job? What am I supposed to be doing here? And you know, COVID almost made it easy. It made it really clear as to what our purpose was. I have to say our staff here are absolutely fantastic. The sense of purpose during COVID was extraordinary, but we simply weren't kitted out at the time in order to deliver. So, you know, we didn't have enough laptops. We didn't have a remote IT system. We had a system that we used to take evidence from witnesses from abroad, and we had to repurpose that and in 3 weeks get remote courts up and running.
Welcome to the Legally Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hanna. This week, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the wonderful Scott Simmons. Scott is a business development coach and trainer for lawyers. He is a business development consultant, was previously the National Senior Business Development Manager at DWF. He has a wealth of experience as a solicitor, and nowadays he is known as a toolbox for turning lawyers into rainmakers. As the creator of Precision, selling methodology, which we'll learn more about later, Scott's mission is to enable lawyers to learn in a simple and systematic formula. So, a very big warm welcome, Scott.
Hi there, Rob. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be chatting.
I'm really excited to be having you on the show. And before we dive into all your amazing projects, experiences, and ideas, we do have a customary icebreaker question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law, if you've seen it?
So, Rob, I've watched 15 minutes of Suits and then I stopped watching it. So I could not give you an answer to that. I stopped watching it because in that first 15 minutes, I sat there and I thought, well, this isn't going to do anything to help how people think about lawyers. So I just switched it right off and I have never gone back.
With that, I think you can give it a resounding 0 and we can move swiftly on to talk all about you. So, Scott, would you mind starting by telling our listeners about your background and career journey?
Okay, so I'm an ex-lawyer. I started off in a small high street law firm in Essex in the south of the UK. I started off in residential conveyancing, and for US listeners, that's real estate. And I had a head of department and mentor when I started who drummed into me, Rob, the importance of the customer service, the customer experience, how important clients were. And that really stuck with me. He put me in front of clients and everything was about giving them an exceptional experience. The problem was, Rob, was that what we could see was at the end of the month, in order to hit financial targets, we were having to do so many completions, and that was impacting the service that we were trying to create. The other impact that it was having was that actually my boss was ill with stress-related stomach problems, and he was out of the office on average sort of 2 days a week. So there was a lot of firefighting going on. And I realised I mean, I was in my early 20s, so, you could throw as much work at me as you wanted. And I was happy to, very, very few responsibilities. But I could see that something needed to change, because what was happening was that we were getting inquiries. And if they tell us the value of the property, we would give them a price from our menu sheet. If somebody, Rob, waited half a second without going, yes, please, we'd go, but if you come with us today, we'll drop it down to this price. So we had this real problem of being in this race to the bottom. And God help us if we found out that someone down the road had dropped their prices, because then we were like, anyway, so I could see that there was a problem about 6 months in, and I took an idea to my boss and I said, this is what I think we should do. I think we should cut out the bottom end of the market. I think we should massively increase our prices, and we should explain to people that what we want to do is work with people who want this exceptional service and want their lawyer to have the time and space to be able to take them through the process and guide them on what was going on. He loved it. He put me in front of the partnership. The partnership agreed to it. And within 12 months, everything had changed. And we went from having, client complaints dropped through the floor, client, experience and feedback and testimonials went through the roof. Our reputation had grown from being really, really local to being really quite regional.
Yeah.
So sort of one side of Essex, the other side of London, up to Hertfordshire, down to Brighton. We really covered a lot of the south. We were getting inquiries from places we could not believe. And the team was growing and we were doing more fees. We were doing more fees, Rob, than we'd ever done, doing 50% less work.
Mm.
But the key one for me was that my boss was no longer ill.
Yeah.
He was not taking off that kind of time that he had previously. And that always stuck with me, that race to the bottom almost became like, without realizing it, an unconscious sort of choice that the profession was finding itself in, but we could do something about it. So I went through my career and I moved firms. I went to bigger and bigger firms. I moved into commercial property, into corporate support. I went into trust and company management, and I finished off in corporate, and I didn't enjoy that at all. And in fact, to the point where it made me ill. And I suffered quite bad burnout. And you won't be surprised to know that I blame an awful, aside from the lack of support that I got, I blame a fair bit of it on the billable hour. But that's not going to be a surprise to you. But I left the practice of law, and I got a lot of inquiries and a lot of requests to just focus in on business development, to help businesses get footprints into the UK. So that's how we created Legal Balance. It was to service that kind of growing need for businesses to have that footprint and into the UK market for business development. But I didn't stop at just working for law firms. I worked across professional services because I wanted to understand what other professional services industries were doing around business development, customer experience, customer service. And eventually what happened was that I could see that there was an opportunity for lawyers to really get involved in the selling process. But in order to do that, I was going to, we were going to have to teach them how to sell, and we were going to have to overcome this mindset problem of I'm a lawyer, I don't sell, or I've got too much on, I can't do the BD. And that's how we developed the BD Breakthrough Blueprint, which is our education course on business development. And then eventually how we turned that into a digital course, which kind of brings us to where we are today.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating journey. And I guess, just understanding your career route, you've always sort of had business development in your DNA, shall we say, sort of either consciously or subconsciously, just learning through that. But let's just break it down, because it's an interesting question. What is Scott's definition of business development? Because you're a business development coach and trainer for lawyers. You've got sort of that legal business development coach badge, consultant badge. What is your definition of business development?
Okay, so the absolute best definition I've ever heard is actually came from my my wife, who is the CEO of Legal Balance and really is the brains behind the company. I might appear to be the face, but really and truly, all the best ideas you've ever seen me come up with come from her. And she explained it like this. She said, marketing is drawing the horse to water. Business development is making it drink. That to me is the absolute best definition of the difference between marketing and BD, but really helps you understand what both marketing and business development are. So marketing is that building that brand, getting that awareness out into the world. And then business development is creating those opportunities, those bringing people into a place where you're not just kind of out there on a big scale. You've then drawn real prospects and leads into your funnel, and you're now having those conversations one-to-one or one to small groups. And business development is turning those prospects into clients.
I love that. And it's, I always say, if you can't explain something simply, how on earth are you going to get people to understand it? I don't think you could have done a better simplification there for everyone to digest and understand. So let's keep you on that momentum, Scott. Let's talk about differences. How do you describe the differences? Because people see consultancy, they see training, they see coaching. How do you differentiate the three and just give people some practical examples, particularly related to the legal profession?
Okay, so obviously you mentioned at the beginning, when I describe myself, I talk about being a toolbox for turning lawyers into rainmakers. Okay, yep. I don't tell people I'm a consultant, trainer, and coach. I use it in my elevator pitch when I go on to explain it. But I describe myself as a toolbox for turning lawyers into rainmakers. And how I do that is that I give lawyers the tips, tools, and techniques to get out into the marketplace, give clients best advice, and win more work. And then I talk about how I, coach clients on subjects around mindset, leadership, culture, habits. And then I give them training on how to sell and cross-sell, how to give compelling presentations that make other lawyers jealous, and how to network with confidence and purpose. Okay, so we've got the coaching, we've got the training elements. And by the way, I think that the coaching and training together are really, really important, because one of the fundamental problems around training, and this is part of why we turn the course into a digital course, is that people come away from training sessions and they feel really great about it. I feel like I've learned so much, and I can take all of this on, and then you get back to your desk, you start doing the work, and everything you've learned just kind of falls away.
Yep.
Because you've got nothing there to keep you motivated, to keep you accountable, to make sure that you are doing what you want to be doing. And so coaching, I think, is really, really valuable, because particularly alongside the training, what it enables you to do is just to keep people on the right track. Now, the consultancy side is when we work with the C-suite, when we work with the directors and the C-suite, the kind of fundamental decision makers in the business, to help them build firm business-wide strategic business development strategies. Because you can have individual strategies about how you're going to reach out to businesses or clients or prospects and things like that. But the business needs an overarching business development strategy, so that everyone's working towards the same goal. And if you, as an individual lawyer, have a business development strategy, but your business doesn't have a business development strategy, it's going to be a bit more difficult for you to get the buy-in at the top and the support at the top. So having it work down like that is really massive.
Welcome to the Legally Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hanna. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan McCall. Ryan is the founding partner of Rushing McCall LLP, a business litigation firm based in California. He is an adjunct professor at Loyola Law School and was previously a fellow in artificial intelligence law and policy at UCLA School of Law. Ryan has experience as a clerk at the United States Courts of Appeal for the Tenth Circuit and as a litigation attorney at firms such as WilmerHale. Ryan also founded the educational technology startup Word Brewery. Ryan's book, Elegant Legal Writing, was published in 2014 February and has gained recognition from high-profile individuals in the legal profession. Ryan is passionate about legal writing, litigation strategies, and advocacy, having spoken at the American Bar Associate Litigation Section and the Texas Office of the Attorney General. So, a very big warm welcome, Ryan.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, Ryan. And before we dive into all your amazing projects, experiences, and everything you've been getting up to for the legal community, we do have an icebreaker question here on the Legally Speaking podcast, which is, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, what would you rate the hit TV series Suits in terms of its reality of the law, if you've seen it?
I can't speak to it too much because I only watched about 5 minutes of one episode, and then it was enough. It was unrealistic or off-putting enough for me personally that that I didn't want to continue.
Well, with that, I think you can give it a fair 0, and we should move swiftly on to talk all about you and your real legal career. So, to begin with, would you mind telling our listeners a bit about your background and career journey?
Absolutely. So I'm currently a founding partner of Rushing McCarl LLP. We're a business litigation firm based in Los Angeles. I'm also the author of Elegant Legal Writing, which came out last month from the University of California Press. Before that, I've taught advanced legal writing courses at UCLA and Loyola. Studied AI, was an AI research fellow at UCLA as well. Clerked for Judge Ebell in the 10th Circuit. Was a litigator at a couple different firms as well before going to UCLA. And before going to law school, I was a high school history teacher for a couple of years. So, and then somewhere along the way in there, I also founded a language learning ed tech startup called Word Brewery, which taught languages and high frequency vocabulary in about 20 different languages using real sentences from the news with the sentences tailored to the individual's current levels. So there's been a continuous thread or theme in all the work I've done. A couple of themes, one being a love of teaching and a love of writing. I also love litigating, but I don't really see those as being completely separate skills. My work as a litigator entails teaching the judge, like through my motions and briefs and oral arguments. I really see it as teaching the court, the judge, the legal rules and principles that will help them decide the case accurately and in my client's favor. And
yeah,
I see the same issue involved internally as I'm helping my team produce the best work product possible. So I never really take off the law professor and writing teacher hat for too long. So those different parts of my current career of teaching, writing, and practicing all fit pretty seamlessly into each other.
Yeah, and you just summed up some super impressive work in a very short space of time there. There's a lot that I want to unpack. I'd probably add one extra layer to that as well. It's tech, right? Almost like advanced ahead of your time in terms of, well, certainly people, when they were talking about AI and language models and everything else and these innovative platforms that you've been involved in, I think there's clearly, a passion for tech in there as well, which fuses in nicely to everything that you're about. But let's go back to your clerk days, because you did have experience, as you say, for the United Courts of Appeal for the 10th Circuit. What was that like? Talk us through your experience there.
It was really a wonderful way to transition into practice because in that first year coming out of law school, I guess the ability to see behind the scenes and work closely with Judge Ebell and his chambers and work within his chambers and kind of get a sense of how judges operate and make decisions behind the scenes was incredibly enlightening. And the full payoff to that experience, I think, only became gradually clear over time as I got further along in my career and closer to the point where I was actually arguing in front of judges and controlling case strategy. It's a little hard to see the forest for the trees a little bit when you're an associate at a big firm. But once you transition, or if you do transition to working in a smaller firm with a smaller practice group, as I did once I co-founded Rushing McCarl LLP with my partner John Rushing, and you're running litigation from the beginning, you're the one that's deciding on the arguments that are going to go into the motion, and writing the briefs personally and with your team. And I would say that having the understanding of how judges think, as well as kind of the lessons in professional, just the different aspects of being a legal professional before the bar, a sense of the dignity associated with it, all that stuff that I picked up for the first time in my work with Judge Ebell turned out to be extremely helpful. I often share one anecdote from my clerking experience with my team, which I think is an important one for those of us who are kind of born to argue and love to argue, and that is that Judge Ebell once told me that you have to listen as an advocate for a shift in the judge's tone from when they are entertaining what you have to say, and then at some point they'll reach a decision and shut out alternative possibilities, and you have to avoid annoying a judge, to make a judge respect you as an advocate because you're showing respect for the tribunal, it's important to listen carefully for when that shift occurs, and then stop arguing, essentially stop talking. And it's even little lessons like that turn out to be very useful over time, because they've allowed me to speak with judges in such a way, I guess, with a level of comfort, because I've worked closely with one for a year, but also in a way that is fully respectful of their office and that they appreciate.
And yeah, and that's such a great point as well. It just comes to mind, 2 ears, 1 mouth. And, I always talk about from my, initial sales training in terms of, tone, pace, volume, really listening out for those sort of subtle details, because details matter. So if you can get taught and pick up those little things along the way, you increasingly become that 1%, 2% better than other people that you're competing against. So thank you for sharing that story. Really interesting. Okay, so you've worked with some powerhouses along the way as well. You've been a litigation attorney for the likes of Wilmer Hale. What skills did you pick up that, again, have helped you as you've moved on to sort of founding your own firm at those types of firms?
I think part of what you learn in those first few years of practice, if you work at a big prestigious firm like that, hopefully, and hopefully in other environments as well, you learn from your colleagues. You learn what it means to be a lawyer, what it looks like day to day, the general habit of understanding the stakes of litigation, understanding the pace of litigation, and how you have to maybe adapt your previous work experiences or your habits as a student to the realities that a lot of your life is going to be controlled by the client's needs, by the court schedule, and so on. And I think one of the most important things that associates can do as they start their careers at a larger firm, when they don't have a whole lot of sometimes you're kind of put on large teams that you're not directly making decisions about the law, about legal strategy. You may just be, I guess helping people with pre-existing projects and helping people with, with writing that they've done, and you're just helping them execute it. It's important. I think one of the things you can get out of that time period is just to realize that you're very early on your growth curve as a litigator. It really is, no matter how smart you are or how well you did in law school, it really does require a major professional pivot, and you are starting really from scratch. You have the fundamental tools that you bring with you, but those are a lot less important and refined than they'll be in 5 or 6 years. And it's a blind spot for a lot of new attorneys, because you kind of assume that you did well in law school, you've done well your whole life, therefore this is just the next challenge, and it's not really that different from what comes before. And I don't agree with that. In my experience, practicing law is quite different from any other life experience I've had, and it requires a degree of self-discipline and resilience, and day-to-day confidence that takes a little bit of time to develop. And every task that you perform as a lawyer, every experience you have interacting with opposing counsel or taking a deposition, working with a client, it's like building a habit, building calluses. I've heard one attorney describe it as, and everything you do, it's easier to do it again the next time, but it's different. It's hard to remember when you're a ways into your career exactly how little you knew at the beginning. And I think that the most important thing that new associates can do is to really try to learn and soak in knowledge, learn by observing the way your colleagues, your more experienced colleagues, go about their day, how they practice, what their thought processes are, what they think is important versus less important, how they prioritize, and be humble about the knowledge that you need to acquire and the skills you need to acquire to be able to represent clients at a high level.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to sort of things that I always tell people to think about when they're starting their careers. Is to almost like be curious and to be a sponge and try and soak up as much wisdom as you can. And it's by being in those environments you'll learn by osmosis, and you'll pick up those little things because by and large it's these little things, because the law is the law, and the way you practice the law and your technical skill sets, yes, they can vary to a degree, but these little things that you're discussing could potentially have a huge impact on how you win cases or how you get ahead of other people and become the top of your field. So you talked a lot about sort of confidence, resilience, a lot of these skills that are needed. I'm sure you've needed them through founding your own firm. People always see the headlines, don't they? They see a law firm, you're owning a firm, it must be fantastic, life is amazing, it's the easiest, best thing on the world. Talk us through your experience from founding, Rushing McCall LLP, and you touched on the type of work you do, but just tell us a little bit more about what you specialize in.
Sure. Meeting my partner, John Rushing, was really one of the best things that's ever happened, if not the best thing that's ever happened in my own legal career. Because co-founding a firm, starting a small firm, wasn't really on my radar until I met him. And John also has a background working at larger firms. He worked at Sidley Austin for 6 years or so, and he also, after that time, had developed experience working as a trial lawyer. Had a lot of success in that domain, and he'd also done a stint as an actor and producer in entertainment. And so John's kind of a larger than life character with this great charisma and this powerful way of communicating and speaking. He's a brilliant negotiator. He's a brilliant trial lawyer, brilliant advocate, and our general inclinations about what we like to do, what parts of the practice we enjoy, and what our skill sets are really fully complementary. So he's an extrovert who's happy being on the phone all day and arguing all day. I'm more of an introvert who likes to have the bulk of my day spent writing, reading, thinking, delegating, that kind of thing, soaking in, getting really deep into the weeds of a case so I can help guide strategy. And so it really everything's really a natural division of labor between us, and between kind of his oral advocacy skills and negotiation skills, client and working with client skills and administrative skills, and what I bring in terms of legal strategy and writing, and kind of managing a case, is it leads to a pretty powerful 1-2 punch for our clients. And so the fact that we both have backgrounds at top firms as well, I think makes us quite different from a lot of other boutiques, in that, we set out at the beginning to kind of maintain the same standards we'd observed and practiced and been part of at the larger firms, and just practice them on a boutique scale. And I think that as a result, people underestimate, other opposing counsel from large firms sometimes initially may underestimate us because we're 4 years old and we have a smaller team, but that's to their peril because we practice law at a very, very high level.
Someone who's easily distracted, I'm very big on sort of, time blocking and being dedicated to a task and setting myself goals, because it's very easy to get sidetracked by one thing or another. And I'm looking forward to talking a bit more about your writing and your books in a moment. But I want to talk about some of your memorable cases, because you've been involved in several high value cases over the years, including securing $17.8 million federal jury verdict for a cosmetic manufacturer. So do you have any other sort of memorable cases or favorite cases that have stood out to you from over the years?
Well, I love, I don't want this to be a cop-out answer, but the great thing about starting your own firm and being part of a smaller group and one of the people in charge of it is that you can pick your clients and pick your cases. And John and I both, John has a master's from Oxford in scholastic philosophy. I have an amateur interest in philosophy. I love legal theory. I love, getting into the weeds on property law. I read books about prose style and linguistics for fun. And so we both have this sort of intellectual drive and curiosity, and it does shape the way we, came into the niche, settled on the niche of business law and business litigation. And it shapes how we pick cases to some degree, because neither of us like, the way we practice, we really like to have a sense of intellectual curiosity about the case that's going to provide its own motivation. So passion for this particular client, passion for this particular matter, And we've realized that complex business litigation cases are the sort that really allows us to make the most of our skill set. Cases where there's going to be some good faith arguments on different sides of key issues, cases with a bit of factual intrigue and that are going to require some interesting investigation. So we have one case, one of our earliest cases, which is still ongoing, is a dispute over a large cannabis business. And it's just an extremely complicated partnership dispute that raises fascinating practical and theoretical issues related to what happens when co-founders go into business together without a partnership agreement or any kind of shareholders agreement or anything of the sort. They just start working together, and then they work together to build a business for 3.5 years, and then things start going off the rails. And trying to understand the law around that and develop it into a story that's ultimately going to be compelling at trial is a really fascinating process. And so there's quite a few cases like that where I've had the opportunity to. I used to have this misconception that you have to be an appellate lawyer or to do interesting legal work. It's just not true. And I like appellate and trial work and pretrial work really the same in each respect, because on every difficult case, most cases where it's clear as day, they settle very early or an insurer covers them. But most cases that once you get into the point where you have dispositive motions going back and forth, there's some kind of good faith core arguments on either side. And very rarely is there something that's so squarely on point that it just resolves it with no problem. So you can write a 1 or 2 page brief. Usually it takes more than that. And so anytime I get to, make creative arguments, that's what I love about my work. And it's what I'm best at. And I get to do it every day. I get to do it a lot more often than I would have expected.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you like the content here, why not check out our world-leading content and collaboration hub, the Legally Speaking Club, over on Discord. Go to our website, www.legallyspeakingpodcast.com, for the link to join our community there. Over and out. Exciting news, listeners. We're pleased to announce another upcoming special mini-series, Legally on the Move, Careers, Tech and Insights from Dubai. In this exclusive series, we're taking the podcast to Dubai, a city that's redefining legal careers, leading in tech innovation and setting the stage for transformative global insights. Here's a sneak peek of what's coming your way. Career stories from top legal professionals thriving in Dubai's unique legal market, the latest on AI, blockchain, and how legal tech is reshaping the future of law, thought-provoking conversations on diversity, leadership, and building global connections. And here's the best part. We'll be recording in some of Dubai's most iconic locations, capturing not just the insights, but some of the incredible energy of this vibrant city. So stay tuned and get ready for Legally on the Move. Trust us, you won't want to miss this journey. Over and out.
Right, Rob, collaborating in Dubai. He's on track with the podcast. So episodes, radio attention nightly. Hot guests joining them, topics so lively. He ain't gonna stop, yo. Y'all know, turn on the mic up. Here he goes. Legally speaking, we got a handle. Yeah, we engage. We ain't never talk this game. Expand. By legal going boom. Rob should explain by his text in bloom. Ready. Podcasting high fidelity, talking legal now, that's a sweet melody. Better believe it, Dubai's a pathway. Tech hitting the bullseye, the legal tech way. Now they become the hub, innovation they resolve. And check out the UAE as they keep evolving.